Hello. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so very much for being with us this morning. My name is Bukeni Waruzi, and I am the Executive Director for Watchlist on Children Armed Conflict, a global network of 12 human rights and humanitarian organizations that work together to uphold the security and rights of children in situations of armed conflict. So today we are pleased to present our latest policy note, a credible list, which is here, a recommendation for the 2018 annual reports on children armed conflict and listings. With this policy note, we target the United Nations Security Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who is currently preparing his 2018 annual report on children armed conflict. This will be his second annual report since taking office earlier last year. We call on the Secretary General Guterres to ensure a complete and accurate listing of grave child rights violators in the annexes to his report. So without further ado, I would like to invite our two speakers to take the floor and comment in more detail on the contents of the policy note. So first, we will hear from Dragica, Mikavica, Advocacy Officer, Watchlist on Children Armed Conflict. So Dragica is the researcher and author of the policy note. Dragica leads the design and implementation of Watchlist advocacy strategies in New York in order to advance its priorities with the UN Security Council, the permanent missions, agencies, and other relevant bodies. And then second, we will hear from Joe Baker, Advocacy Director, Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. Joe is the Advocacy Director of the Children's Division at Human Rights Watch, and as the founding chairperson of the International Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers. She helped the campaign successfully. She helped successfully for the campaign on international treaty banning the forced recruitment of children under the age of 18 or their use in armed conflict. She has conducted field investigations on children's rights in Burma, Ghana, India, Indonesia, Morocco, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Uganda, and the United States, and many other countries. Based on her expertise on the issue of child soldiers, she has addressed the United Nations Security Council, testified before the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, conducted trainings for U.S. and African military officers, and testified as an expert at Dutch war crimes trial. Today, she's also here in her capacity as the chair of the Watchlist Advisory Board. Finally, we will have a few time for a roundup of questions and answer, if any, in the audience. So, Dragica, please welcome.
Thank you, Bukeni, and thank you to those of you who are joining us this morning here in the room and on your screens. Last year, our network began a tradition of publishing its recommendations to the UN Secretary General in support of drafting his annual report on children in armed conflict, and the annexes that accompany it with the lists of perpetrators of the grave violations of children's rights, or what is commonly referred to as his list of shame. This tradition was inspired by the fact that as members of civil society who are keen on ensuring the greatest possible protection of children in situations of armed conflict, we were not okay bearing witness to blatant interference of politics by certain member states with the Secretary General's listing process, which is principally based on impartiality and patterns of documented UN-verified evidence gathered through the Monitoring and Reporting Mechanism, or the MRM. In our view, in his 2017 report, the Secretary General took positive steps towards improved accountability for perpetrators by, for instance, listing the Saudi Arabia-led coalition forces for killing and maiming and attacks on schools and hospitals in Yemen, and the Popular Mobilization Forces, or the PMF, closely linked to the Iraqi government for recruiting and using children in armed conflict in Iraq. However, Our recommendations for listings last year included 9 other parties, in addition to the Saudi-led coalition and the PMF. As we anticipate member states exerting undue pressure on the Secretary General again this year and the continued interference of politics with the listing process, we take this opportunity to call upon the Secretary General to once again use his report to include the most complete and credible listing of perpetrators based on documented UN-verified evidence of data on violations. Doing so elevates children above politics and sends a strong message to all perpetrators, regardless of who they are, a state security or a peacekeeping force, a non-state armed actor, or a coalition of states, that these crimes will not be tolerated. In addition to this call, we have observed that the UN's ability to monitor, report, and respond to grave violations of children's rights in conflict is rapidly diminishing in light of shrinking political space and resources to UN peacekeeping. We further call upon the Secretary General to advocate with the member states for allocation of sufficient and dedicated staff and budgetary resources for child protection in the field. Otherwise, he will not be able to produce his annual report and oversee the implementation of action plans. For the update of our policy report, we conducted a systematic, desk-based review of all credible reports that were publicly available regarding incidents of grave violations for 2017. In our research, we considered 25 relevant country situations where children's rights are known to be violated in conflict, but the publicly available data on incidents came up for only 12 of those, which you see in the report before you. The sources we reviewed include the Secretary General's 2017 annual report on children in armed conflict, reports by UN agencies and treaty bodies such as the Human Rights Council, governmental reports such as those produced by the U.S. Department of State, and reputable international non-governmental organizations such as Human Rights Watch, Doctors Without Borders, and Amnesty International. We examined data on the 5 violations that trigger listings in the Secretary General's reports, including recruitment and use, killing and maiming, rape and other forms of sexual violence, attacks on schools and hospitals, and abductions. We used the Secretary General's 2017 annual report on children in armed conflict as a springboard for our analysis of countries and parties, coming up with a universally applicable threshold for listings based on the minimum number of cases he seemingly used. For example, in 2017, the Secretary General listed parties for a minimum of 4 verified cases of rape and other forms of sexual violence in his report, so we used the same threshold to suggest other parties to be listed. Our information in the policy report is by no means an exhaustive list of all incidents these parties have committed in 2017, but they serve to formulate the following recommendations. There are 3 sets of recommendations in our policy report before you today. First, we recommend the Secretary General to include 6 parties from 7 countries in his 2018 annual report's annexes. In each situation, we found a sufficient amount of information is available to list them. The parties are state security forces in Myanmar, Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Israel, and non-state armed groups in the Central African Republic, Mali, and South Sudan. Second, where we found that mentions of parties in the 2017 report raised serious cause for concern for the protection of children, but the information provided by the UN is insufficient, we recommend that the Secretary General gathers further information for the purposes of determining whether 4 additional parties should be listed in his 2018 report. These are the Kurdish groups in Iraq, the African Union Mission in Somalia, or AMISOM, international coalitions involved in the conflict in Syria, and the armed forces of the Philippines. Lastly, we continue to find information on violations against children being committed in Ukraine, and once again strongly urge the Secretary General to address the situation in his report, at the very least by mentioning it in the narrative, but to use his teams on the ground to further gather information on violations by all parties in this conflict for the purposes of determining any listings. It is worthy to mention certain examples from the policy note for these country situations. In the report, we recommend the Secretary General list Tatmadaw or the Myanmar State Security Forces on the basis of sufficient, credible evidence of grave violations, namely killing and maiming of children and rape and other forms of sexual violence. In Myanmar, in just one attack on a village called Tulatoli in Rakhine State on August 30th, 2017, Human Rights Watch estimated hundreds of Rohingya were killed by state security forces, including children being killed at the beach, their bodies tossed into the river. Imagine a 5-year-old girl's death at the hands of a soldier for struggling to keep up pace with her fleeing family. Doctors Without Borders reported 730 children under 5 were killed in Rakhine between August 25th and September 24th, 2017, out of at least 6,700 Rohingya deaths, according to a survey they conducted in refugee settlements in Bangladesh. Over 59% of these were killings of children, while 15% were burned to death in their homes, and 2% died as a result of landmine blasts. Imagine a girl not older than 15 years of age being forced out of her house, tied to a tree, and raped by Myanmar soldiers. This is one among numerous crimes of rape and other forms of sexual violence our peer organizations have documented in Myanmar in 2017. The Myanmar state security forces should be held accountable, and no member state should take it upon themselves to try to protect it from falling subject to the Secretary General's listing, given high political charge of the conflict in this country. In addition to possible politicizing of the Myanmar listing this year will once again be Israel. For 2017, we found numerous UN-verified publicly available incidents showing patterns of killing and maiming of children by the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza. Scores of Palestinian children have continued to be killed and injured as a result of various clashes and demonstrations in 2017 at the hands of IDF. And in October 2017, the UN committee responsible for investigating human rights violations in the occupied Palestinian territory even reported use of tear gas, sound grenades, and rubber-coated bullets near schools. As you recall, in 2015, powerful member states on the UN Security Council have proactively lobbied against the listing of Israel, but the Secretary General continues to report UN-verified patterns of violations in the body of his reports year in and year out, which should comply with his criteria for listing parties such as the IDF in the annexes. This year is yet another opportunity to remedy repeated omission of the IDF from the list, and member states should respect the impartiality of this process with respect to holding perpetrators to account in Israel and Palestine. As stated, our research for 2017 shows that 4 other parties should be investigated by the Secretary General for the purposes of determining a listing in his 2018 annual report on children in armed conflict. For example, in Syria in 2017, amplified by most recent airstrikes in Raqqa and other besieged areas of the country, we found credible, publicly available reports of killing and maiming of children by both the U.S.-led International Coalition Against ISIL and through the Russia-backed Syrian airstrikes and those of the Russian forces. According to the Syrian Network for Human Rights, 97 children died in 2017 from international coalition forces bombardments. The Secretary General should follow in his good example of holding the Saudi Arabia-led coalition to account by listing them to also put his foot down on grave violations against Syrian children by gathering and using all evidence to determine whether he should list the international coalitions committing these crimes on a daily and hourly basis. In Somalia, we continue to be concerned by the UN's reporting on incidents of rape and other forms of sexual violence by AMISOM troops, and we recommend that the Secretary General seriously investigate any reports received and list AMISOM should he find credible evidence to do so. I reiterate again that regardless of who the party is perpetrating grave violations, including peacekeepers, they should be held to the same standard of accountability as anyone else. Our final observation based on our findings is that despite the fact that incidents of killing and maiming and attacks on schools and hospitals are occurring each year since the conflict started, Ukraine has yet to be featured in the Secretary General Annual Report on Children in Armed Conflict. Between February 16th and May 15th, 2017 alone, UN recorded 193 conflict-related casualties, of which 3 boys were killed and 9 boys and 1 girl were injured. From April 14th, 2014 to August 15th, 2017, the UN tracked 90 deaths of boys and 47 deaths of girls in Ukraine. On an ongoing basis throughout 2017, the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, or OSCE, Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine continued to publicly report on child deaths, which are detailed in our policy report before you. In addition to children being killed and maimed, their schools and kindergartens have been attacked and damaged by heavy shelling, shrapnel, and undetermined weapons to the point where many of them have been forced to close. Given credible evidence of violations in 2017, we strongly recommend that the Secretary General consider adding Ukraine to his report and collect information through assessment missions regarding violations committed on both sides of the conflict. In addition to sharing these examples that illustrate our recommendations in the report, it would be remiss not to point out another significant factor impacting the Secretary General with respect to children in armed conflict. As a network of organizations that has been following the evolution of the UN Security Council's Children in Armed Conflict agenda since 2001, we have become deeply troubled by the rapidly shrinking space and regression for child protection at the UN, given, firstly, the member states' trend of streamlining mandates of the relevant UN peacekeeping and political missions, followed by budget cuts to missions and consolidation of child protection functions into human rights components. Without the designated capacity on the ground for the UN field missions to monitor and report on the grave violations of children's rights, there is no possibility that the monitoring and reporting mechanism and the country forces can respond to violations and dialogue with parties to conflict to end and prevent those violations as per Security Council mandates. We have noticed this manifest in clear cuts of specialized posts of child protection advisors and child protection officers who are crucial to the work needed to deliver on the Security Council's agenda on children in armed conflict. These cuts are particularly disconcerting to us, and we call upon the Secretary General to advocate with member states for allocation of dedicated, specialized capacity in terms of budgets and staff, and that it be maintained in 2018 in UN peacekeeping and political missions. At the end, why is the list and the capacity to produce it so important? Parties care not to find themselves on the list, so much so that they would go the length of threatening to pool funding from UN programs in blackmail. The UN created the Children in Armed Conflict agenda and its tools, such as the list, to facilitate dialogue with parties to conflict, and has garnered positive change over the years. 29 parties have signed action plans with the UN to date, and all state security forces who are currently listed have them. As a result, measures have been and are being taken to revise national legislation to comply with international standards of protection of children. Armed groups are complying with their commitments to release children from their ranks, and donors are funding reintegration programs for children formerly associated with armed forces and groups. However, in order for the UN's framework to function, the MRM needs resources on the ground, and this is why we follow up our call for a credible and complete list of perpetrators with a call for dedicated capacity for the UN to monitor, report, and respond to violations, which is increasingly harder as powerful states on the Security Council try to save money on peacekeeping. In his second year, with the opportunity of drafting his 2018 annual report, we count on the Secretary General, Guterres, to hold all responsible parties accountable, regardless of who they are, and stand up for children's rights in conflict. Thank you.
Good morning. My name again is Jo Becker. I'm the chair of the advisory board for the Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict. I want to speak a bit further about why this list is so important and why it's important that we get it right. First, the parties on this list are stigmatized. Nobody wants to be on this list. And that creates a real incentive for parties that are listed to do what it takes to get off the list. Secondly, the listing opens a dialogue between violators and UN country teams. Country teams are under a mandate from the Security Council to enter into this dialogue to try and get concrete agreements about what it takes to end violations. And third, this listing provides an effective mechanism to achieve concrete improvements, not just from member states, but also from non-state armed groups. In fact, the majority of parties that have signed or and implemented action plans have been non-state actors. Once a party's on the list, To be removed, they have to agree to and fully implement a concrete, time-bound plan of action that's negotiated with the UN country team. And the Secretary General has previously said that parties are only going to be delisted after a full cycle with no violations, so no violations for at least 1 year. The action plans include really important components, not just halting violations, but disseminating command orders, providing the UN with access to military facilities for purposes of verification and monitoring, implementing measures to hold perpetrators and their troops accountable, and establishing high-level focal points. The last dozen years or 15 years have shown us that this listing is a powerful and effective tool in the UN system. We've seen action plans in 5 countries, Chad, Cote d'Ivoire, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Uganda, that have successfully resulted in the delisting of both government armed forces and non-state armed groups. Last year, for example, after years of being on the list, the Congolese armed forces were delisted because they had finally implemented the action plan to end and prevent the recruitment of child soldiers. On the ground, we've seen the concrete impact of the list and the action plans, including the demobilization or the release of thousands of child soldiers, the professionalization of military recruitment and screening practices, stronger accountability measures, and greater respect for international norms. Last year, the Secretary General announced expressed his intention to strengthen engagement with parties that are on the list, to engage with them on a more continuous basis, and to sharpen efforts to prevent violations. This kind of engagement is critically important. However, we don't want it to include measures that might erode the effectiveness of the existing mechanisms that we have. So last year we were a bit concerned when the Secretary General added a new subcategory to his list, specifically for parties that have, quote, taken positive measures to protect children. This is a very ambiguous designation. It was not clear at all what these positive measures might be. For example, the Saudi-led coalition was placed into this category, even though, as we've seen throughout this past year, violations against children in Yemen have continued unabated. The Saudi blockade has impeded entry of fuel, food, and medical supplies to populations in need, leaving millions of children on the verge of famine and without treatment for a cholera epidemic. The Saudi-led coalition still has not entered into an action plan with the UN to end their violations against children. And giving the coalition credit for positive measures does a real disservice to the millions of children who are suffering. If the Secretary General continues this designation, we urge him to be more transparent about the criteria for inclusion in this sublist, and to also be crystal clear that to be delisted, parties must sign and implement a time-bound action plan to end violations. There are no shortcuts. We look forward to this year's listing and urge the Secretary General to make it as accurate and comprehensive as possible, with no political interference. In the recent past, as Dragica has mentioned, we've seen too much pressure by member states to shield themselves from scrutiny. Instead, all parties should focus on the only legitimate way to stay off the list, which is to end violations against children. Thanks very much.
So we will invite one or few comment, please, and we can start here.
Thank you. Joseph Klein, Canada Free Press. This question is actually for Ms. Becker. You are the Advocacy Director of the Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, as listed here. And yet, in this report and a set of recommendations regarding Israel, there's no mention of Hamas or any other Palestinian terrorist groups. And the reason I'm directing this question to you is because back in 2015, Philippe Balopian, who was, as you know, the Crisis Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch, said that not only Israel should be included on this list of shame, but also Hamas, quote, for their wartime conduct harming children. And there have been many reports since of Hamas's use of children as human shields. Social media is replete They boast of their summer camps for training children with military weapons, etc. How can you call this report and set of recommendations credible and complete when you omit any reference to Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist groups?
Thanks for the question. For the annual listing, the Security Council always asks for listing based on the previous calendar year. So the report for 2018 is going to be looking at violations that were reported and documented by the UN in the year 2017. Dragica has outlined the methodology that the watch list came up with for its recommendations, which focused on reporting by the UN's monitoring and reporting mechanism, other UN sources, and the conclusions that she reached. The evidence that we found from 2017 specifically did implicate the IDF, but maybe Dragica would like to add something further.
Well, before you answer that, I have to respond, because looking at this summary of your report, or maybe this is the report, I don't know, but you mentioned the UN, but you also mentioned other sources. And there are quite a number of sources that are credible, that have pointed to abuses by Hamas within the last calendar year. And all you have to do is look at social media for yourself and see their own posting of their summer camps for children fully armed and engaging in military exercises. So how can you maintain, frankly, the credibility of this report? In Ukraine, you said there should be investigation of both sides. Why not, at least at minimum, call for investigation of Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist groups, where there's quite a bit of evidence in the last year of their alleged misuse of children?
Thank you, Joe. That was a very adequate description of what we've tried to do with this particular policy note. In terms of our methodology, we used 2017 reporting by the Secretary General to first start drafting our list of parties to look into for this note. So this time around, we've tried to source information on Israeli settlers and other groups, but they simply have not been mentioned in his 2017 report. So it's a very simple reason to have focused on IDF, because that's predominantly what he focused on in his 2017
I don't want to belabor
report.
this, but you cite in your summary on the IDF the Defense for Children, International Palestine,
Yep.
And you have other sources cited in addition to any of the UN sources.
Yep.
I know, but I have to follow this up. I'm sorry. I have to. I will complete in a minute. But this is the floor. I'm sorry, but we're not getting a full, honest answer here.
I'm sorry, gentlemen. I think the answers that have been given, I think they are quite
Speak for
credible.
itself.
All right. So who takes? Yes, miss.
Hi. First of all, welcome from the UN Correspondents Association. My name is Widad Franco with NHK, Japanese Public TV. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned about the budget cuts at the UN. And I was just wondering if you have any more you can be more specific, which cuts and how they are affecting carrying out the protection of children. And do you suggest any of the countries that are suggesting these cuts should be listed or contacted? Can you elaborate on this? Thanks.
Thank you for that question. I was really hoping that the budget cuts would come up in this discussion. So, for the past year, we've been advocating for a credible and complete listing of perpetrators when we realized that there is a much larger danger for the agenda kind of being eroded from below, and it's happened in several places in the UN system. And we've noted that, first of all, in terms of language and mandate renewals, member states on the Council have tried to, in the spirit of not having Christmas tree mandates, cut. So paragraphs on child protection have gone from, say, 3 to 1. Last year, UNAMA in Afghanistan was one example of that. And then that was followed up with parallel negotiations in the Fifth Committee, or the Budget Committee of the UN, where, for instance, because child protection was consolidated under human rights in 3 of the 5 political peacekeeping missions that have standalone teams on this. Say in MINUSCA, in the budget negotiations last year, China had proposed cutting all human rights posts, whereas 90 of them were actually designated for child protection. So the examples continued. The second round of negotiations in December, there was a proposal to cut UNAMID, which was actually passed and approved, of 55% to child protection and 65% to gender. So what we've started to see is, and perhaps there might be some politicizing of this as well by certainly member states who don't want to see human rights in the Council. They've essentially used the budget negotiations to undermine thematic agendas at the UN. So I would say, the most of the discussions that have gone on, at least from the budget side, have taken place between the U.S. and China. And of course, this is in the spirit of trying to be more proactive about, efficiency and peacekeeping. It's just gone under the radar that the thematic agendas have been undermined as a result. So those would be the member states that we're in conversations with, as well as other friendly countries.
Yes, sir.
Hi, James Reinl from Arab News. Thanks so much for the briefing. Back on the Israel question, obviously it comes up again and again every year. But there are a couple of things that I think we could possibly say have changed since last time it came up. One of them is that you've got a Trump administration which is very clearly taking a stand on Israel's behalf against what it sees as bashing by the United Nations. The second thing, I think, is a domestic Israeli concern, and it's the very well-publicized case of Ahed Tamimi, the young girl who came face-to-face with a Palestinian soldier. Obviously, she wasn't, injured, but it does somehow bring together these ideas of the Israeli Defense Force and its interaction with Palestinians. Could I get you to comment on both those issues, please?
I think what you say about the Trump administration, standing up for Israel is perfectly true. I don't think it really has impact on the listing that we're presenting today. I would note that on the IDF's treatment of Palestinian children, one of the issues that we are concerned about and that has repeatedly been raised in the Secretary General's report is detention and due process of Palestinian children who have participated in protests or have been picked up on suspicion of illegal activity. Detention by itself is not considered one of the grave violations, but we are concerned that there are, hundreds of Palestinian children that have been, charged and detained within the Israeli system, and that there are credible court cases or reports of torture in some cases against these children. Certainly Israel is not alone. There are about 13 of the 20 countries that are examined in the Secretary General's report where detention in the context of armed conflict or on the basis of national security is mentioned. And especially in the context of extremist armed violent groups, we're seeing in some countries a real rise in rates of detention. That's a real concern to us.
Yes, ma'am.
Last year the report was delayed by 6 months or so, and there were many excuses or at least reasons behind that. When do you see this next report coming out? And can you elaborate more on the China-U.S. budget talks and human rights monitoring in peacekeeping operations? Thanks very much.
Yes, the report was very delayed last year, but I think we can guess why. We hope that the production of the report will be on time this year. Typically, we see advanced copy of the Secretary General's report in early to mid-spring, so April, May. And we are confident that together with his special representative for children in armed conflict, he'll do a timely job of producing a credible report. We don't see the delay happening in the same way as last year. In terms of the China-U.S. Budget talks, it was really about reducing numbers and funds to specific missions. Right now, MONUSCO is coming up for mandate renewal, and we know that it's being cut by 40%. UNAMID has taken a huge cut last year. And again, this is trickled down to the areas on child protection and gender. And because they're not as favored or don't have the political support from certain member states, they get attacked first. And a part of this is also a technical reason of different sort of parties within missions negotiating budgets versus negotiating language and resolution. So this is something that we've been trying to bring to the attention of member states on the council and remedy by building up capacity of experts who are charged with budget negotiations versus following children in armed conflict.
Yes, sir. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coast for Access. Thanks for the briefing. And I think with the small number of journalists here, we can all get as many follow-ups, I would think, as we want. I wanted to ask, I have one question for Watchlist, which is, if you're suggesting the listing of AMISOM, do you believe that the UN provides support, has a support mission to AMISOM? Do you think that they should either cut their support, as they sometimes do in terms of due diligence in DRC with units of the Army, or should they somehow ramp up their human rights training? What should the UN do about AMISOM's record with children? And the other question is it may be for Human Rights Watch. It's a double-edged question, which hopefully I'll be allowed to ask, which is that I've covered Cameroon pretty closely, and it seems to be an armed conflict, and there seems to be children being killed. In fact, I've seen quite a few photographs of the government killing children. So I wonder if this deference to the UN doesn't seem to be publicizing this or reporting on it. So maybe, one, what can you say about that situation? And two, this was the Human Rights question. It seemed like it's a small thing, but I was looking at the World Report 2018 and the whole list of countries, and I didn't see Cameroon in it. So obviously this jumped out at me, and I've tried to pursue it a couple of times with Human Rights Press, but I haven't found. I wanted to know. I know that you know them well. What's happening with that? Thanks.
Sure, I'll start with Cameroon. Thank you for raising the concern. We are concerned about what's been going on in Cameroon. It's definitely on our radar. We have not, usually the countries that are listed in our world report are those where we have had capacity to do our own investigation and reporting. And because of resources, we have not had resources to devote to Cameroon thus far, but we are actively talking about investigations in coming months. So we will certainly be looking at violations against children in that context.
I just wondered, I'm sorry, because I definitely the Amazon one, but I sort of, because I also saw that like Togo and Gabon weren't in there. It seemed like a whole region of Africa where there's a lot of issues, not just children in armed conflict issues, but crackdown, longtime presidents. So it really is a reason? That's the, because that was the answer that I was looking for. But I guess if that really is the answer, that it's a policy decision.
There are over 200 countries in the world, and we Human Rights Watch generally manages to cover human rights developments in about 90 countries worldwide. So that obviously means that some are left out. There are more than 50 countries on the African continent, and our team is stretched. So that certainly there are violations going on that need to be investigated that we simply haven't been able to look into.
Okay, because I see Canada, I see not to say that there's not issues.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot. I don't mean to belabor it, but on Amazon. Thanks a lot.
Just to follow on to Cameroon, this is one of the countries that I looked into for our research purposes, in addition to Niger, Nigeria, so all the Boko Haram countries where we have concerns, serious concerns, in terms of what happens to child protection in face of state security operations and countering violent extremism, as you might call it. And we were not able to source publicly available data on credible incidents of violations to include these countries. So really appreciate the question on Cameroon. There are a couple of ways to address the AMISOM question. First of all, we continue, and last year in the first edition of the policy note, we also called for further investigation because the Secretary General continues to report on rape and other forms of sexual violence by AMISOM troops, but it never results in a listing, and typically the text in the reports you'll see refers to, follow-up and prosecution of individuals, etc. So we would really like to keep our attention on it, especially in recent times where issues have risen around sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers. Now, AMISOM does have its own standalone child protection capacity, and for instance, there's a child protection advisor that's been seconded to work with Somali National Army and other troops and collaborate with the peacekeeping mission on follow-up on child protection standards. Of course, the problem is always with DPKO's inability or the UN's inability to follow up on the type of training that the troop contributing countries are supposed to be providing to their troops. They simply don't have the mandate or the ability to do that. So one thing we've called for in the past has been oversight for the UN on what type of training they do. Another thing that you might recall from our previous years advocating for is this ban of listed troops from contributing to peacekeeping. And it has been a powerful tool and a powerful stick, I would say. Ethiopia is on the council, and I would single them out just to say that in the recent negotiations of texts through the Security Council Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict, they have definitely paid attention to any mention of rape crimes by AMISOM troops for obvious reasons. So I see potential areas for engagement and trying to address some of these gaps. But for the time being, we would really like any sort of alerts or violations to be seriously considered for the report this year.
I'll try to make it shorter this time.
Okay.
Again, one of the sources, non-UN sources you cite in your section on Israel is the Defense for Children International Palestine. What was the criteria for choosing them as a source?
They're a credible intergovernmental organization. Non-governmental organization, sorry.
Well, it's an NGO, non-governmental, right?
Absolutely. And in our methodology, we explain that we use credible sources by INGOs and NGOs.
Do you use groups that are active lobbyists for particular political agendas, which is what they are? They have lobbied Congress on their agenda, and they support the BDS movement?
Our intention is to report on incidents of violations and look at country situations, without respect for who's perpetrating the crimes that are included in the report. And these are peer organizations that are doing documentation on the ground of child rights violations that we use as sources.
Well, did you consult with other NGOs like UN Watch or other groups that may have their own sources of data and explanations? And you chose only this one, which is validly anti-Israel.
We take your point on CDI Palestine, and we'll look into other groups reporting for the next year's report.
Is there any other questions? If not, so thank you so very much, and please grab one of the hard copies of the policy which is there, and in that folder you'll find the contact information. So for any follow-up questions that may come up via email or via phone, you have all the contact in that folder. So thank you so very much for coming, and thank you so very much for the panel. And we will